typically for the young kids, the lower the tension, the more power you get. So when you buy a racket like this, they can be a little stiff, meaning they can be a little tough on the arm. So in order to combat that, what you want to do, especially for young kids, is you want to put a soft string in there at a low tension. Most young kids will go anywhere between 40 pounds and 50 pounds. 40 pounds being low on the low end, which is giving you more power. 50 being on the high end, which is going to give you more control. When you put the string in the racket, this is the tension holder. Okay. So what this does is this pulls the tension and it sets the tension on the racket. Okay. The tension of the racket varies depending on who bought the racket, what they want from the racket. Do they want more power? Do they want more control? Do they want more durability? Typically for young kids, you don't worry about durability because they're not breaking a lot of strings. So what you want to do is you want to put a soft string in there at a fairly low tension, which gives them the power. 40 would be low, 50 would be high. So the recommended would be about 45. They start to get older and older and they get bigger and stronger, they need less power. So what you do is as they start to get older, you start to go a little higher in tension, which will give them a little more control. So as starts to get to 8, 9 or 10, we would maybe go from 42 to 44 and we would do small increments. You don't want to go much higher than 50 in my opinion when they're that young, because if you do, it's very, very tough on their arm and it can give them tennis elbow or anything like that. So I'm very conscious here at the shop here of putting my young kids in a very, very soft string with a soft tension. It's like a trampoline effect. So the lower the tension on the racket, the more spring. So the lower the tension, the ball's going to come off the string a little faster. Typically the ranking guys will go with thicker string because the thicker string lasts a little bit longer. They don't want to be breaking strings every 10 minutes. And also a thicker string will give you more spin and more control. So those top level guys that hit with a lot of spin, that have a lot of power, they typically go with a thicker string at a higher tension for more spin and more control. But in saying that, there's a lot of different players out there. Like Pete Sampras used to string his racket at 70 pounds, which is very, very, very high. And then you have guys like Andy Murray, who strings it a little bit looser to give him a little bit more power. Federer and Nadal are both if I remember correctly, they're both around 60 pounds. Which is a little more on the higher end. Every racket comes with a recommended tension. So when you purchase a racket, there'll be a recommended tension there.
Okay, what about this one?
So for this one, it's going to have 50 to 59. Okay. However, if they're a young kid, I like to go a lot lower than that because my experience with it being a former player and being in this shop is when you start to string these rackets too high for young kids, it can hurt their arm. So for a young kid, 6, 7, 8, 9, you really want to keep under about 50 pounds. And then the pros, they vary. They do string more on the higher end, but there are pros that string very loose too. It just depends on what you want from your game, right? If you're looking for a little bit more power, you want to go low end. If you're looking for a little more control, a little bit more spin, you go high end. First of all, if you get a pre-strung racket that's an adult racket, typically the string they put in there is not very good. It's like a factory string and they string it at about 50 pounds. With all the kids' rackets, they're all strung and they're all strung at around 50 pounds. But keep in mind, the string that comes with the rackets is never that good a quality string. It's more the string that I have here or the string that we use here is a little bit thicker in texture. It just feels a little bit better when you hit the ball as opposed to like a factory string. So factory strings can be a little bit problematic. But if you've got a kid that doesn't really play much and he's just getting into the sport for the first time, then the string that comes in the racket is fine. But as you start to progress and as you start to get better and better, you probably want a string that's made from one of the companies, one of the better quality strings. When you start to put a better quality string in there, it's just more powerful. It feels better when you hit the ball. When you hit with one of those cheaper strings, it's kind of a more like pingy. Not as much feel, not as much power. And they're just factory strings. So most people, what they end up doing is they end up cutting them out at some point and then just putting in a nice string. For a racket like this, there's a string on the market made by Babolat, which is called Excel, which is very, very popular. It's very smooth, very soft, very powerful. I typically like to string most of my young kids with that string because it's very, very nice on the arm. It's very powerful. And for young kids, they're looking for that extra power. When you're in the middle of a match or you're playing competitively, if you break a string, you want to be able to go to your second racket that has the same string as the first racket. Otherwise, it's going to feel different. If you're playing a match and you break a string and you're going to a backup racket that has a completely different setup in there, it's going to throw your game off because you're not used to it. So 99% of people that walk through my door that have multiple rackets, they use the same string, same tension. We're going to use this string here called Excel, which is a string made by Babolat. Doesn't mean that you have to use this string if you have a Babolat racket, but what I like to do is I like to use this string in Babolat rackets because it's made by the same company. It's a very soft string. It's very, very easy on the arm. Like I said, the only downside is it doesn't last quite as long. But if you're not breaking strings, then it's better to use a softer string than something that's going to be harsher on your arm. So this is what I'm going to put in your son's racket right now. Okay. And I think what we talked about, I've seen him hit. He's a pretty good little player. So I'd probably want to string it a little bit higher because he already has some power. So I'd like to go more like 45, 46, something like that. If he's just starting and he doesn't really have the swing down yet and he's looking for that extra bit of punch, then I would string it closer to 40. But I don't like to go over 50 pounds. Beauty about stringing is if you want to change it, you can change it down the road because you're constantly changing strings. My rule is however many times you play in a week is how many times you should have this racket strung a year. So if you're playing twice a week, you should have your racket strung every 6 months because they start to lose tension, they start to lose quality. They won't necessarily break, but like I said, they will lose quality. So my advice is if you're playing 3 to 4 times a week, which a lot of these young kids are, you probably want to have it strung every 4 to 5 months. If I put this in your son's racket and for some reason he comes back in a few months, or you say, hey, Tim, he needs more power or he needs more control, then we make an adjustment. You know, we make an adjustment. We go, if he wants more control, we go from 45 to 47. If he wants more power, we go from 45 down to 42. But you don't want to go lower than 40 and you don't want to go higher than 50. Now, I'll just show you a difference, though, in a different string. So like a string like this, very popular string made by Selenko called Hyper G. This is a little bit of a thicker string. It has a little more grip to it. So this is going to last longer. It's going to have less power, but it's going to give you more spin and more control. So this is very popular for kids as they start to get a little bit older and they start to break strings and they're looking for a little more spin and control in their game. What also you can do is you can do a combination of both strings. So that's kind of popular too. This is becoming popular these days. It's called a hybrid setup where you mix a control string, thick string like Hyper G with a soft string like Excel, and you mix them up, you put half in the main and half in the crosses.